Welcome to the Forever 80s podcast, hosted by Liz Worth, where we talk to fans, artists, collectors, and more about all the things we love about the 1980s. All right, welcome to the podcast. Hello, my name is Liz Worth, and I am here today with Rob Rohm, musician, songwriter, and founder of DepecheGlobal.com and Depeche Mode Global fan group on Facebook. Welcome, Rob.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Liz.
I'm excited to have this chat because I love Depeche Mode, and I know so many other people do. So I'm really curious to talk to you about what it is about Depeche Mode that you love so much and what first drew you to them. And when I was preparing for our chat today, I had taken note that you said that you were a fan of Depeche Mode since 1985. And so I am curious if you can take me back to being a teenager in 1985 to get us started. What was going on then? What was the mood? What was the atmosphere?
Sure.
Set the scene. Mm-hmm.
Back in 1985, I was actually in middle school. So my middle school extended to ninth grade here in the States. Typically, that's now high school. But mine was 7th, 8th, and ninth grade. And so some friends played me Depeche Mode for the first time in the spring of 1985. I was 14 at the time. And sonically, their music was different than anything I'd heard. You know, I was already into like little different electronic things like M's pop music or Kraftwerk, things like that. But when I heard Depeche Mode the first time, it just was awing, basically, And then the lyrics kind of resonated. They were interesting lyrics, and all of that kind of drew me in. And then so when I got into them, Shake the Disease came out around that time. So then that was another song, and that actually became the number one song in Southern California on K-Rock radio, which for the year 1985. So K-Rock was also very pivotal in introducing the band to the masses. Unfortunately, I was 14, so I didn't really know about concerts. And I wish I had, because they played probably, I think, their biggest concert to date as a headliner. They had sold out the Hollywood Palladium, and they added a show at Irvine Meadows, which was like a 17,000 capacity venue. And that sold out. And I don't think they had even headlined any type of shows like that themselves, even in Europe. The World We Live in Live in Hamburg was recorded on that same tour in Germany. And that was only like a 6,000 capacity venue. So, I regret that I wasn't of age that I realized how the concert scene worked. But when Black Celebration came out, I still wasn't old enough to drive yet. And my dad drove me to the record store to pick it up the day it was released. So that was the first album I ever picked up on its release from the band. And I fell in love with it on first listen. The dark tones, the dark music, everything about it. And that ended up being the first concert I would see. I would see them on July 13th, 1986 at the Forum in Los Angeles. And then I actually went back-to-back nights. So I saw them again in Irvine at Irvine Meadows, that same venue that they had sold out the year prior. And once I'd seen them, there was no turning back. I was completely hooked, a huge fan of the music. And ultimately, they became, as many people have said that are big fans, they're pretty much the soundtrack to our lives. So especially, I've been listening to them almost their entire career. So it's pretty amazing.
Oh yeah, I love all these details too, right? Getting an album on the day it's being released, and going to the store to get it.
Yeah, it was a Music Plus. I wish they still had those record stores. Actually, that same store is where I camped out to buy tickets for their show at Irvine Meadows. So it was an interesting experience those days when you had to camp out for concert tickets.
Yeah. Things are so much easier now in some ways. I can't say I ever camped. I was never brave enough to camp out for concert tickets. I always thought people who did that were like really, really, really courageous.
Sadly, it didn't help much as far as my seats were not great, so,
okay.
the following tour, Music for the Masses, was the first time I actually used a ticket broker, and I had fourth row seats at the Forum when they played there in December of '87, which would ultimately be almost the same show they performed 6 months later at the Rose Bowl. But yeah, once I also experienced that, I kind of got spoiled in wanting to be up close, because it's a far different experience when you sit up close watching the band. And so I was lucky enough also to be second row at the Rose Bowl. And yeah, so now I'm always usually trying to be within the first few rows if I can, just because it's such a different experience and so much. Yeah, you're not even following the video visuals as much. You're watching the band perform, and they are great showmen. So especially Dave, obviously, but yeah, that's another aspect to the band. They have such amazing performances. You know, a lot of synth bands. I think I had tickets to the Pet Shop Boys in 1986, and they actually canceled their tour because they thought they would be too boring to watch. And now they have this over the top production, I guess, right? I've never ended up seeing them because I was so mad that they canceled the tour that I've never bought tickets to see them again. But yeah, most synth bands you wouldn't think of necessarily being great live performers, right?
Yeah, I remember in the 90s. I wish I could think of the artist's name, but there was someone who was touring here where I live in Canada. And I remember that there's a big fuss after their show because they were a solo performer that was doing electronic music. And the whole time during their set, they just stood there eating bananas and things and just kind of pressing buttons on the keyboard. Right? It was meant to be sort of a joke, but I think some people in the audience took it a bit personally because, yeah. So yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah, I actually saw Pet Shop Boys about 5 years ago. Maybe it was before the pandemic and everything, and they came out in disco balls. It was pretty cool.
Yeah, I've heard their shows are like way over the top. So
yeah,
I guess they've made sure to ensure that their shows are not boring for people.
Yes, yeah, but yeah, if if you forgive them, I recommend going to see them. You had mentioned, something about the dark tones of Depeche Mode, and that that's style, right? That very specific style that I think a lot of people are drawn to when they hear Depeche Mode. And for you being in Southern California, I know that there's something about that darkness that seems to really take off in that part of the world. There are a lot of goth bands that have come out of places like LA, right? There's a whole scene that you can trace back to sunny California. So what is it about the state of California that seems to really love that dark music?
That is an interesting question. One of the darkest, during the 60s love movement, you could talk about the Doors were actually one of the darkest, and they were from Southern California. They formed in Los Angeles. And actually my mom told me when I was a baby in my crib, she was always playing the Doors for me. So maybe that kind of led towards my love of dark music. But I know as a teenager getting into the band, that all of us teenagers usually have this teen angst, kind of whatever it is. We're against the world, authority, everything. And that kind of felt like it was something that the band's lyrics kind of resonated with you when you're listening to them. So not just the dark music itself, but the words that they're saying. And a huge thing about Depeche Mode, and I know I've seen little memes and things or particular studies about as far as the level of education like that you would need to understand their lyrics is higher than a lot of the bands out there that make popular music. So I know I've seen some sort of study on the internet way back when, and Depeche Mode was way up there. So yeah, that was also another appeal to the band.
Oh, wow. I haven't heard that. I love that though.
Yeah. It's pretty pretty interesting. And when you think about it, there is also a layer of mystique because Martin doesn't like to talk about what his songs actually mean because he knows that people interpret them in different ways and he doesn't want to ruin it for people. But when you listen to things, I mean, it sounds weird, a song titled Fly on the Windscreen, right? That's on that album that I first heard. But when you think about it, windscreen is obviously windshield here in the States, but it's just a song, a love song about, the urgency of life, that it's, a fly on a windscreen landing on your windshield that dies instantly. We all are all here and we don't know when we're going to go, right? And that whole darkness, I think that especially resonates as a teenager because that's kind of when you're realizing that you're mortal, that there is mortality. And so that whole thing, and it's come full circle actually with their latest album, Memento Mori. Most of the songs are actually about death and our mortality. And even oddly or ironically, it was actually written before the passing of their bandmate Andy Fletcher, so that even the title, which it translates literally to "Remember You Must Die," that was all created before Andy's passing, which is very ironic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very eerie, right? When you think about it that way.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's something about Depeche Mode lyrics. They do sound so personal, right? There's a storytelling element to them, and it is so easy to project meaning onto lyrics and onto a band, right? We can sometimes like bands so much that we want to know who they are. We want to feel close to them. We want to feel like we have some kind of relationship with them, even though as fans, they don't often know that we exist, right? We're just one of many.
Yeah, I think they've also kind of done a good job, again, with that whole mystique. There's a lot of artists that are sometimes too accessible, and you find out too much about them that you don't necessarily, they kind of let you down, or there might be issues that you don't want to see the human side of. But the band is very guarded and very almost mysterious. But then again, when you do have opportunities to get to meet them, they're actually really nice guys in person. But just like their whole level of publicity, none of them are on social media, all that kind of thing. There is a shroud of mystery behind the band, which maybe that helps sell the mystique of Depeche Mode. I don't know, but it probably seems like a good thing, actually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so interesting. I think to be a band that continues to be so successful that doesn't have to go through conventional marketing channels in this day and age.
Yeah, it's also kind of frustrating a little bit for some of us longtime fans that they, like this album period, they have not even released a physical single. So all of us old collectors, there's no, there were a couple 7-inch singles that were done for Ghosts Again in Germany and in France, just included with like their copies of Rolling Stone magazine or Music Express. But there was literally no single CD record. The only the record that was released was the album itself, but none of the singles. And another thing for us, because I also collect the Depeche Mode stuff, but on the tour, they don't have tour programs. So I've had a tour program for every tour since. I actually even bought one for the Some Great Reward tour, even though I didn't attend it. But I have all the tour books, and there isn't one this tour, so it's kind of a bit of a disappointment. But maybe they know what they're doing. I don't know. Mm-hmm. Seems like a little lost opportunity to make some easy money, but.
Well, maybe they'll hear this and they'll change their minds.
Yeah, if you're listening, I hope you come out with a tour book.
So, for me, I find Depeche Mode an interesting band because, I came of age in the 90s, right? So at the time, grunge was really popular. Everyone was moving away from electronic music. everyone was moving away from things that had been popular in the 80s. But then Violator and Songs of Faith and Devotion came out in the 90s, and those were huge albums for Depeche Mode. And those albums really also, I think, brought them to a whole other level in their career. And so I'm curious on your opinion as to, why was Depeche Mode able to circumvent what was going on in mainstream music at the time, and why did they continue to be able to be so enduring and so successful?
The band themselves have even said this, that, and it is kind of true, and my family actually teases me about this. They call us a cult, basically. So where that's taking me is that I feel like the band has this strong following, a loyal following, which a lot of artists don't get to. Someone's not going to necessarily listen to your album 10 times before they really like it. So if on first listen it's something that's not of interest to someone, people are just going to discard it. But with Depeche Mode's following, we all give their albums ample opportunity, listen to them multiple times, grind it in our head, basically. Also, I'd say Violator in 1990. So Personal Jesus was released in 89. So it's still kind of 80s and even 90. So they're still like flowing from their success. That's the first album since the Rose Bowl was filled with, they say 70 to 80,000 people. So I think that all catapulted. But then they kind of morphed, like David Bowie was always known as the chameleon with the changes he did all the time. They kind of morphed with the Songs of Faith and Devotion because Dave was living in Los Angeles at the time, and he was into Jane's Addiction and Rage Against the Machine. And so he even took on that look, so he wasn't like the clean cut kid from Basildon. He now looked like a grungy rock star, and their music took on a little harder element. Personal Jesus has some guitar, and they started incorporating guitar more on Violator, but it took it to a whole different level on Songs of Faith and Devotion. And a lot of that was probably because of Dave's influence being into the rock scene and wanted to take it to that next level. So I think them adapting that way also made them fit in better during that 90s period. And then there were, at that time, there were also other electronic acts that were becoming very popular that were grungy, but they were the harder side. So like Nine Inch Nails was on the Lollapalooza 1 tour. They took off, had extreme success from that tour. I think they sold the most merch on that tour, even though it was headlined by Jane's Addiction and Susie and the Banshees. And then the next Lollapalooza tour, Ministry was on that bill. And they're another in the similar vein of Nine Inch Nails, and they actually were more like a Depeche Mode band when they first started with their earlier synth pop stuff, and then they both migrated harder than Depeche Mode did, but Depeche Mode continued that, that they still have that core song structure, that the key melodies and things, but they didn't take it to the extreme like Ministry or Nine Inch Nails.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. Nine Inch Nails seemed to make a lot of sense in the 90s, right? But yeah, Depeche Mode, I think again, it's such an interesting thing with them because there were so many bands in the 80s that just sort of petered out for a while in the 90s. Like they had to, sort of retreat back from music for a while. And now there's this huge upswing again, right? Where so many bands are on tour again, and they're still putting out their music. And there's obviously a lot of interest in a second life that's going into a lot of 80s music. But Depeche Mode always seemed to be very steady and always there.
Yeah, and they've always tried to not label themselves. They just want to make good music. They were on their first release ever was on Some Bizarre Album, which was put together by a guy, Steve-O, in the UK. It had Soft Cell, Blamage, B-Movie, The, and that record itself was labeled like the futurist movement, but they tried to avoid being titled futurists or new romantics or any of that. So I think that's done well for them to try to avoid any. Unfortunately, in music, obviously everything becomes categorized. People have to try to label it somehow or some way, but that's not always advantageous for the music producers themselves. It's just for people consuming it. But even actually, part of what became big, the label alternative, Depeche Mode was big on that. Same with like the Smiths and the Cure and a lot of these acts from the 80s that were not like the new romantic. Like Duran Duran was labeled new romantic. They kind of reinvented themselves a little bit. Like in the 90s, they came out with Ordinary World and Come Undone, and but they had embraced earlier on in the 80s that whole new romantic movement with like Spandau Ballet and all these other Ultravox. I guess Ultravox was part of that, but yeah, it's interesting. Maybe I rambled on a little bit too much about that whole categorization thing, but I think they've done a good job avoiding that overall. And part of that, I think, like we mentioned earlier, is the huge following that they have that enables them to do what they want to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think there's something about that categorization, because then, you understand it from a marketing perspective, right? You're on a major label. They want to know, I guess maybe it's a bit different these days, but, what slot does it go into at the record store, right? But yeah, I think bands have to also feel free, right? Free to evolve. Artists want to evolve. A lot, I think it's human nature, right? We want to move on to the next thing that excites us and inspires us. And that's not always a linear process.
Yeah, I think that's helped with their longevity, because they've never been a band about, let's do a greatest hits tour. They had their one singles tour, but that was pretty much like their first tour, because they didn't tour for Ultra, because Dave was still coming over his addiction issues. And so they had only played like a party in LA, which I was thankful to be at, and then one in London for Ultra. Those are the only two shows they did for Ultra. And then so that following year, they ended up doing a singles tour. But other than that, they've never done like, it's always out to promote a new album. And they've always said that, if they're not doing a new album, they feel like, they're just, they would never do like U2 did their Joshua Tree 20 years later, and this year they're doing their Achtung Baby revisited, whatever. I don't think they would ever do like Black Celebration revisited or Music for the Masses or Violator or anything like that. They have to continue to put out music, and thankfully, like this latest album, I think it's like their best album in decades, actually. Mm-hmm. So it's great that they're still pushing the envelope and continuing to create great music.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's always really exciting when you see artists doing what inspires them rather than doing what they think everyone's going to want from them. Mm-hmm. I think it's good for us creatively too, right?
Oh yeah, and you could never pull the masses, the people, because everyone is going different directions. Where someone wants this, someone wants that, and let the band do what's best.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So you started your fan group in 2017. Were you part of any other fan groups or running anything similar before that, or was that the very beginning of this for you?
I had initially, years before that, did some sort of like Southern California group on Facebook, but the whole way that Facebook was ran back then, it didn't really do anything, and I just kind of ignored it. But the reason I started this one in 2017, the Depeche Mode Global Fan Group, I hosted Depeche Mode's Facebook page on July 9th of 2017. I was just coming back from Europe. I had seen them in Paris on the Global Spirit Tour. And so I was day 114 of their fan takeover. And after I did the takeover, I was just inundated with requests from all over to be my Facebook friend. So I decided, maybe I should put together a group and everyone can join this group. And and that's where it started.
Yeah, I mean, that's all of those things sound so exciting. Traveling to see Depeche Mode and then winning this contest.
Yeah, I actually found out that I was hosting their page when I was in the Barcelona airport going back to London, and I was gonna have to prepare all my materials while I was in Europe. Luckily, I had taken my laptop with me, but I had to prepare my posts because they need to like review them and everything. So my posts were actually posted when I got back to the States, but I had just flown in like late the night before, and I was hosting on a Sunday. But it was great because I got to interact with fans all over the world. On, you know, I was commenting, replying to every comment, and it kind of helped with my jet lag, get me back on schedule. So I spent the entire day just commenting to people, and it was a lot of fun, actually.
It sounds really fun. And so that inspired you to do your own fan group and keep that momentum going.
Yeah, and I had no idea that, you know, it would take off to this level. But also, the greatest thing about that fan group is when the pandemic started. So with a few of my friends, I suggested that we do, I called it a drinking chat, where we just get a bunch of group members together on a Zoom call and just talk about Depeche Mode and have some drinks, like if you're hanging out at the bar or something. And it evolved during the pandemic to just an amazing level where we were having guests on that, you know, were performing for us. We had so like Brian Griffin, who did the photography for the first 5 Depeche Mode albums. He was a guest on there. We helped fund one of his books. Like a lot of the members ordered the books. We had Gareth Jones, producer of Some Great Reward, Black Celebration, and Construction Time Again. We had him as a guest. We had performances like from Bon Harris from Nights Are Ebb. My friends from the Reflex, which is an 80s new wave type of band, cover band. I think they were one of our earlier performances. We even had like an Argentinian Depeche Mode cover band perform online for us. And so we had people from all over the world joining us. This great YouTube guy, Von George, who's become a good friend. And actually, I just came back from Berlin and London, and I got to hang out with Von George and Brian Griffin, who I never got to meet them in person until just this month. So it was a great trip.
It's amazing. When you were, if you think back to being in middle school in 1985, hearing Depeche Mode for the first time, would you ever have imagined that you'd be running this fan group now?
No, it's crazy to think that this, and I'm still as passionate about the band as I was, maybe even more so now, right? But there's definitely been moments that are surreal where, like, when I'm having. So Gareth Jones produced my favorite Depeche Mode album, Black Celebration. Brian Griffin did the cover art. We also had Peter Kerr, who directed the music video for Stripped and Shake the Disease. It's called The Heart. Stripped is my favorite song from Black Celebration. And to have all these people joining me on these Zoom chats for, to talk about Depeche Mode, it's been incredible, and something, that 15-year-old, 14-year-old would just be floored to think that was going to happen in the future.
It's amazing. There's something really special about being a fan as well. I don't know if you feel this, but I just think just being able to give yourself over to something so passionately and say, this is a part of my life. This is a thing I love. I want to spend time celebrating this music that I really enjoy and that means so much to me. There's something really special, I think, about being a fan as part of your identity.
Oh, absolutely. And a great part about that is a lot of the fans, we all get to connect, and you kind of feel that same bonding. It's like almost like a family, because you all love that same, you're all big fans of that same band. It's been great. Like how I mentioned, I went to Berlin and London. I got to meet up with people that I had been seeing on these Zoom chats for years, but I've never met in person. Even in Berlin, I I'd never been there before, never been to Germany. We had like a meetup before an event at Hansa Studios, and just with Depeche Mode Global fan group members, there was like 30 people that showed up just in a foreign country, and there were people from all over. So there's people from Australia, from Finland, from South America, from all parts of the world, and it was just amazing to get to meet up and hang out.
Oh, that's amazing. What do you hear from other Depeche Mode fans when they talk about what Depeche Mode's music means to them?
I feel like it's very, very similar for everybody. Everyone seems to have those same tones, which I was mentioning, the lyrics and the music, and there's a lot of the Depeche Mode were very innovative in the 80s. I mean, you could still say they're innovating even with the new album, but especially back then. I mean, it's kind of like I kind of compare them to like Star Wars movies, where the first three movies were so far ahead of anyone else, and that's how Depeche Mode was in the 80s. Their music, I mean, a lot of the artists, you listen to something that was released in 84 now, and it sounds very dated, but if you listen to Master and Servant, it's from 1984. The song does not sound very dated. It sounds like it could have been released today. But those are the initial Star Wars movies. You know, there's still more Star Wars movies, but now we're kind of, it's not as you're not as awestruck with these new albums as you were then, because then it was so different. You know, we're kind of used to it, I feel like. And that's the same thing with the Star Wars movies now. Like we've all seen all those effects and all those things in everything. And Lucas basically revolutionized movie making, right? So, and Depeche Mode kind of did that when they were doing with their whole sampling and the layering of their synth sounds and things they did. It still sounds fresh today.
Yeah, I think that's something that is, unappreciated in terms of the 80s, is that innovation and that sound. Because I don't think a lot of people realize that electronic instruments were still quite new at that time. And if even if you consider it from the 50s into the 80s, music itself was going through this really incredible, innovative golden age. And I think we take a lot of those sounds and styles for granted now. But it's that's why each of those decades has its own sound and its own feel and its own aesthetic, right? Because every decade people were creating things slightly differently because they had access to these instruments that were new at the time.
Right. All those decades you mentioned, they do have their own sound. And it's funny because you try to think of what are the sound of these last 2 decades, and I don't know that you can identify something particularly.
Yeah, I don't know either. I think these days it's a lot of creative energy is going into the internet, right? Creative energy is going into trying to be an influencer now, or trying to start an online business or something, and those things can be interesting in their own ways. But I don't know that as a society, humans are putting as much creative energy into music at the same level that was happening previously.
Yeah, and not necessarily. I also think not that people are just looking solely at making money at it, but the whole music industry has been turned upside down as far as that goes. So, the only way to really sustain yourself musically is by touring, and even that's why I feel like the band has focused more on the touring aspect than anything else, because obviously they're making massive revenues from their shows, but like physical releases, as I mentioned earlier, but I guess those don't even matter, right? So
It's also really expensive now if you want to put a vinyl record or something, right? It's really expensive to press vinyl and to ship it.
Well, there's also a whole huge backlog. So like I was trying to press a single, and they were telling me it was going to be a year and a half before there was any chance of pressing anything, which I don't want to wait a year and a half.
Wow. Oh my gosh, that's so long. Why is that? Is it because there are so few pressing plants now, or?
There aren't enough pressing plants to meet the demand, and they're obviously prioritizing major labels and things,
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there's just maybe that's a good industry to get into. I don't know, but it's there's definitely not enough demand, or not enough to meet demand, I should say.
Okay, yeah. So if anyone's looking for a business idea, there you go.
Exactly.
So tell us about your music. I'm curious to ask.
So I was doing, excuse me, I was doing music in the early 90s, late 80s. I got inspired by Depeche Mode, of course, and other artists I would see. Well, the other artists that I am still a big Doors fan. I also bands like Love and Rockets and Echo and the Bunnymen. Those are influences. And so I was doing music, and things were actually coming along pretty well. And then I pretty much ended up time to get a real focus on a job and everything, because I had a daughter, and I wanted to make sure take care of my kids. And so basically I had my kids, raised them, and now that they're both adults, I decided, I actually ran into John Fryer, who a producer extraordinaire. I ran into him at NAMM show. He was actually the engineer on the first two Depeche Mode albums, but he produced like 8 of the tracks on Pretty Hate Machine from Nine Inch Nails. He produced Love and Rockets' biggest selling album, their self-titled album. He was responsible for the signature sound of the Cocteau Twins. He was actually, as a musician and producer, in This Mortal Coil. And we had dinner one night, and I was telling him how I used to do music, and he was telling, and I said, I loved it, but I'm too old now. And he's like, you're never too old. And he inspired me to get back into it. And so I released my first single last year, Fade to Nothing. And I wanted to produce it as a vinyl, obviously, but with that huge delay, I just ended up putting out a CD single of it. And the B-side is a track called Who Am I, which when I was younger, I came across some words my mom had jotted down, pondering existence and life. And so I put them to a song. And so she's credited on that single. And it was cool because it was in some record stores, and she got to see that. And she loves the track too. So it's really cool. I wanted to make sure to release that. It was actually her birthday yesterday, so I want to send a shout out, happy birthday, to my mom. But yeah, so that was the first song, and I did a video with Johnny Lee, who is a good friend of mine. We used to have a recording studio together, and he does music as well. And he actually moved to Vietnam. He's got this massive following. The Hotel Lobby is the name of his like electronic type music, and he's won an MTV Moonman Award for one of his videos he directed for Taboo from the Black Eyed Peas. So he did the video for my song Fade to Nothing. And yeah, so I was pretty thrilled and happy with that. I love the response. And I released my second single earlier this year, and I kind of rushed it out. Not the song itself wasn't rushed out, but like as far as promotion and things like that, I was trying to time it. I decided to get it when the Depeche Mode album was supposed to be released on March 17th, but they delayed it a week. So I thought, you know what, I'm going to put my song out on March 17th since they didn't. But with all the things going on that at the time with the shows, because I went to the first shows in Sacramento and LA and ended up going to New York as well, I didn't get as much time to focus on promoting it or anything like that. So kind of regret that aspect of it. But it's all self-released at this point, and I'm working on a full album. And I've been lucky and fortunate enough to work with John Fryer to produce all these songs. So the guy is a legend, and the elements he adds to it, it's great. So
that's amazing. Yeah. Yeah, that sounds great. So when is that coming out?
I'm hoping to have, I want the album to be done by the end of the year. I just don't know, because I do for sure want to press it on vinyl. So I don't know if I'm going to decide to delay the release until the vinyl's available, which that's supposedly what kind of delayed Depeche Mode's album release was the waiting on the vinyl. So yeah, it'll depend on what things are looking like, and I might have to make a decision whether, I'm going to release the album digitally and on CD first, and then put it out as a vinyl later.
Okay, so maybe end of 2023, but we're not making you sign a contract agreeing to that right now. It's not. Exactly. Yeah. Okay. This is not a hard promise, but you can set the intention for it, right?
Right.
Yeah. So given that your music is influenced by Depeche Mode and you run this fan group dedicated to Depeche Mode, you talked about or implied something earlier that I want to ask you about, which is that sometimes, when you get close to a band or you meet a band, it changes your perception of them, right?
Sure.
And it can be fraught. And I know, I understand that too, because I used to do a lot of music journalism, and sometimes I'd be so excited to interview someone and then I'd meet them and I was like, oh. And it really can change the way you hear that music and the way you feel about it. So, I'm curious about this for you and how you manage that, because I have chatted with some other people who run fan groups, and for them, they have sometimes had some friction in terms of the artists or in terms of people in the group. So how do you keep everything balanced in a way that stays enjoyable for you?
Well, luckily I have a group of, I call them moderators for the group.
Amazing.
So they help a lot with policing the group itself, and with the group membership requests, and anytime there's any kind of friction or whatever, we can discuss anything and any kind of course of action. Luckily, there hasn't been too much along those lines, but there are always incidents and things here and there. But even the group itself kind of self-polices, so like people will report any kind of comments, because it is a private group, so our posts are only visible to you if you join the group. Like, you can't share our group comments or whatever. I mean, unless you screenshot it or something, but it's just not, as far as Facebook's algorithms go, you can't share the posts to other public things. So, but yeah, it's been really good, actually. And I'm thankful, it's given me many opportunities that, like when I went to Berlin, I was put on the guest list at the parties at Hansa Studios and Metropole, and I went to see Depeche Mode in New York. There was an after party. They put me on the guest list there, and even were hooking me up with drinks, and so it was just kind of nice to be rewarded a little bit because there is a lot of hard work. All the things that I did, especially during the pandemic. I mean, we even had like a 1-year anniversary drink and chat. It was almost like a Lollapalooza, but like a virtual thing with all these performances and guests. And I even made shirts for it. And it was pretty amazing, but there's certainly a huge amount of work that goes into all that stuff. And I don't do it for any kind of recognition or accolades or anything, but just out of passion for the band and to share that passion with other fans. But it is sometimes nice to get some great reward, as you would say.
I like that. Yes. Yeah. And yeah, it's amazing to you that the band recognizes what you're doing, right?
I hope they do. I don't know for sure that they do, but I know that people around are well aware, and I'm sure at some point, I know people have mentioned, because we even did like a Depeche Mode Jeopardy tournament, and I know people mentioned about that to the band and things like that. So
yeah. So even within their orbit, right? There's some awareness there. Yeah, I think that's amazing. Sure. Yeah, it's really cool. How much time do you spend on this? Is it really time consuming?
It can be very time consuming. Lately, I haven't spent close to as much time as especially during the pandemic. I was putting in so much time, but we had a lot of time, right? We weren't going anywhere, doing anything. These days, because I'm such a big baseball fan and we have arguably the greatest player in the world right now on our team, I've been spending a lot of time going to baseball games and concerts. So I haven't been able to invest as much as I have before. But that's the great thing, is that there are so many other people that are part of this, and it doesn't just need to be me doing it. So there's a lot of great content, and people from all over the world are sharing, their stories of people following along on the European tour, or even members from the group that are going, like visiting from the US to Europe. They're posting in there, and they're getting to meet up with other fans from the group that, they wouldn't have had anybody to meet with. And now they're all hanging out together, and they're sharing their stories and their images from the shows. And it's just really great.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing to create something that brings so many people together, online and offline.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's the thing I'm proudest about with the group.
Mm-hmm. You've also mentioned a lot of other great bands today, right? Echo and the Bunnymen, for example, Ultravox. I'm curious because so many of those bands, again, they continue to play, to tour, to produce music, and they're also collecting new fans, right? A lot of people who are of younger generations really like bands from the 80s. And so I'm curious, as our last question today, what is it about the 80s that you think is so enduring, and why do people continue to be drawn to that music of all generations?
Oh, that is a really good last question there. I think the quality of the music, there was a lot of innovation, and lyrics were very powerful and meaningful. Obviously there's a lot of that. You could also look at the 80s and there's stuff that's frivolous, but a lot of these artists that we mentioned, they're the ones. And I think that's why they were so groundbreaking, because they were kind of going against the norms of popular music. And that's usually when you find the best creativity, is things that aren't trying to be the norm, right? Even that whole Apple program, Think Different, that's, I think, the key to why their longevity is there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. And I think too, maybe by not going with the norm right from the beginning means that they're able to continue too, right? Because if you've never had to fit into a specific time, then you can be doing your thing at any time.
Yeah. And to touch on that a little further, a lot of those artists that we're talking about, they were signed to like the Smiths and Depeche Mode. They were signed to indie labels in the UK, which, if they were signed to major labels, it would have been a whole different story, where they would have forced them to manufacture hits and changed what they're all about. By allowing them to do their own creativity, that's what they let them blossom and become what they are. So I think that played a big factor in it as well, the whole indie label UK scene.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And yeah, artists being supported, right? Financially supported, but being able to have the freedom to express themselves.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah. Really having someone truly invest in them, which is definitely lacking these days, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, Rob, this has been great. Where can people join your fan group if they're interested in checking it out?
So you can go to Facebook and do a search for Depeche Mode Global Fan Group, or you could go to depecheglobal.com and there's a link there. And if you want to check out my music, you could go to robrohm.com. It's all one word, basically, Rob, ROHM.com.
Yes, amazing. Well, thank you so much. It's been great to chat with you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. It was a great chat. I appreciate it.
All right, thanks for everyone for joining in on the podcast today. I will talk to you again soon. You've been listening to the Forever 80s podcast hosted by Liz Worth, where we talk to fans, artists, collectors, and more about all the things we love about the 1980s. If you like this episode, let us know. Hit subscribe, leave a review, or share it with a friend. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll talk to you soon.